Hello, it's the Great Canadian Begler here coming to you with a slightly different video than I normally do. This isn't about polling. As you can see, this is a map of Ukraine and the Russo-Ukrainian war, and this video is about why I think the West broadly, but more specifically maybe the media of the West, I can't say is specifically what NATO chiefs and generals are thinking, are drawing the completely wrong conclusions from this war. Let's get to the top. So there's been a lot of discussion at this point. We're about 4 weeks into the war. Why is Ukraine still standing? Everybody thought, not everybody, I will amend, many people thought that Ukraine was not going to last a week. Some were generous and gave them 2 weeks. We are at 4 weeks now. Russia seems to have stalled out, which I'll go into later. And, well, as you can see, there is plenty of Ukraine that is Ukrainian controlled. And, while significant, a much smaller portion that is controlled by Russia, or proxies. So it's safe to say at this point that this isn't going to be a quick war. A proper blitzkrieg style war would probably take 5 or 6 weeks, and it's almost unthinkable that with the commitment, the level of force commitment that Russia has, and the success they've had so far, that they could even conceivably defeat the Ukrainian military in 2 weeks. Now, that's not to say Russia's losing the war. Russia's just doing it much slower than the West, at least Western media, thought they were going to do. I think it is safe to say that barring any actual military intervention from NATO, Ukraine isn't going to win. Now, Ukraine might be able to fight Russia to a settled peace and not a total surrender. I'm not sure what this settled peace will look like. I can get into that later. But what we have now is Russia's clearly failed a blitzkrieg. Now, you might argue they might not have been trying to do a blitzkrieg, but they're definitely not achieved that if they were trying that. Now, there's been many reasons thrown out why this might be, some ranging from kind of laughable, some making more sense. So starting with, I think, the reasons that seem more laughable, there's an idea going around, I don't know how true this is, that the Russian military forces are extremely low morale in period. Like, the bulk of the military is not well respected and well treated by the Russian government and really Russian society. And as a corollary to that, officers aren't generally promoted for competence, but promoted for loyalty to Putin himself, which does not generally get the best officer corps. Now, if this is true, this would be a major factor. Spirit de corps is quite powerful and important in the effectiveness of military formation. It just seems extremely implausible to me that this is a meaningful factor. Like, if the military's morale is that low, it would be impossible to hide it. And it doesn't seem that way. It would also be extremely foolish to do an invasion like this if your military has such phenomenally bad morale. In fact, you would expect it to be obvious. There should be a lot more mass surrenderings if the military morale is actually meaningfully low. If it's not meaningfully low, then it's just kind of hearsay, and it doesn't actually matter. And it doesn't look like it's low enough that there is any mass surrendering. So at that point, does it matter? The officers being ideologically picked, I can't verify this, but it does seem fitting for dictatorship. Again, can't verify this, so it's kind of just hearsay. Now, moving into more concrete things, what we can see in how Russia's actively done the war, their military doctrine, particularly urban warfare, is not well suited for quick wars, especially if they try to avoid indiscriminate civilian casualties. It seems like their doctrine basically is built around drop artillery and bombs on something in urban warfare and slowly push. But they are doing their best, it seems, to not indiscriminately bomb and shell cities. So they're failing there. Now, moving to what I think are the actually good reasons why the offensive is still stagnating from Russia's end. The biggest one and the first one, from all the intel that is available right now, from NATO, from Ukraine, from Russia itself, Russia's only committed about 200,000 troops at the total. I don't know how many have been killed, but 200,000 was their initial deployment. They have about 50,000 allied troops, from the Chechens to Syrians to the militias from Luhansk and Donetsk. So they have about 250,000 men. The Ukrainian military is about 250,000 men. They have about 900,000 reservists who are some degree called up. I don't know what the degree is, but some level of them have been called up. And they have an probably completely unknowable amount of militia and pressed conscripts, i.e. the people from like Kiev or Kharkov who've been given like AKs and told to fight for the country. Those kind of people. Probably an untold number. Now, the last group I don't think are probably particularly effective except in urban settings, but if we just look at reservists and standing military, Ukraine outnumbers Russia. That said, Ukraine doesn't seem to have the armored vehicles, and particularly the armored doctrine required to actually attack, and they don't have the air offensive or air assets to really attack. Like, they have enough forces to do localized counterattacks, but not to push Russia all the way back to Russia. That said, localized counterattacks are very useful, but Ukraine's military forces seem almost entirely good at defense and pretty inadequate at offense here. And now, the final element that might be hindering Russia's attack, in likelihood, when I say might, I think it almost certainly is, based on reports from Ukraine itself. Ukraine and Russia have the same air defense systems, more or less. They have the same airplanes, more or less. And it seems from Ukraine, which means it's almost certainly affecting Russia, based on the fact that we don't see many Russian airplanes, it's very difficult for the S-300 systems to distinguish between Russian and Ukrainian fighter jets. I don't know the exact numbers, but Ukraine has admitted they have shot down several of their own jets. So if Ukraine, which has a much smaller air force and much smaller large SAM batteries like S-300s, has shot down their own planes, Russia, who has, in theory, significant more of both assets, would be very concerned of shooting down their own planes, and likely has shot down their own planes. This seems to have limited Russia's use of air assets, which we can see is quite verifiable. They are barely using air assets. They should theoretically have complete air supremacy based on paper air force sizes, but Russia does not seem to be deploying airplanes at all, or airplanes to the degree that they theoretically could at all. They seem to have the advantage in the air, but they don't seem to be doing mass bombing raids. They don't seem to be doing mass interdiction. Their seed systems do not seem to be very effective. Or, equally, S-300 modern air defense, like the S-300 or S-400 systems, could just be very hard to hit with seed. That is a possibility, which I think we shouldn't discount. And this goes back to one of where I think people are starting to draw the wrong conclusions. One of the wrong conclusions is that Russia's seed is bad. This might be true. but we haven't actually tested, as far as I'm aware, Western seed versus modern, or relatively modern, S-300, S-400 systems. Perhaps the advances in the air defense system and its active protection measures mean seed planes are significantly less effective at suppressing the air defense. That is one option, and the other option is possibly Russian seed is terrible. We don't know which one of these there are, and I would always caution, on anything to do with military, do not immediately assume the enemy is incompetent. And I'm referring to Russia as an enemy in this case because, well, NATO, Canada as part of is a NATO country, so NATO is obviously opposed right now to Russia over the invasion of Ukraine. That's literally the entire war is about this one thing. So, it is extremely foolish to assume incompetence when we shouldn't assume that. When there's other options, maybe NATO at home, with their more up-to-date intelligence on their own military assets, is better aware of these capabilities, and they can make their own conclusions. But I really caution against the media and just regular Joe Blows going around and saying, Russia's air defense, seed sucks. Well, we don't know that. How good is Western seed at defeating air defense? I don't know that. You don't know that. The only people who could possibly know that would be the top army generals of NATO. And even then, they might not know that, because you can wargame a seed plane like a Tornado ECR. That might be antiquated now, but doesn't matter. You could wargame seed planes testing against our air defenses, but that's not a real war. It's not exactly correct. It can help you and give you ideas, but it's not exactly correct. And obviously, why would NATO be publicly releasing that data? As far as more, it's not publicly available. And I don't know why they would. Why would you tell people how good your seed is? That doesn't make sense. So we have this factor. And then we get into what I think is the more important factor here. So people are... What's the word I want to get at here? People keep assuming that the main reason why Russia sucks, or is failing at this war, is intrinsic Russian military issues, i.e. the low morale, bad officers, antiquated doctrine, poor logistical capacity, or logistical planning. With the implication being that a Western army in the same circumstance would have better success. In other words, if you just took the 250,000 Russian allied troops and replaced them with 250,000 NATO troops, which, for the record, would be most of NATO's frontline military capacity, or at least most of the flexible frontline military capacity, that they would have a more successful advance into Ukraine. This I vehemently disagree with. Even without knowing the intimate details that planners at NATO might know, that I do not know, it is pretty safe to say that a mirror war where country A that NATO is invading, that is similar size to Ukraine, that has a similar population to Ukraine, that has a similar willingness to fight as Ukraine does, who's getting armed by equivalent military equipment, top-of-the-line military equipment and trained by equivalent special forces units, I think would have the same difficulties. The principal problem that Russia has right now is they don't have the numbers to push hard. And a big part of this, we'll start off with this one here. So, zoom in a bit. We have the city of Kharkov. Sorry for the blurriness. This is the best image I could get. You might ask yourself, why hasn't Russia just encircled Kharkov? It's pretty close to the Russian border. They've enveloped it, but why haven't they finished off the encirclement to properly siege it? Because the way it's fighting right now, well, the Ukrainians have all these highways, and they probably have railroads that are completely unmolested and can completely resupply the city. So at this point, it is physically impossible to take Kharkov unless you put overwhelming military capacity there. But Russia doesn't have the forces here. Why is that? Well, zooming out again. This all boils back down to Russia's manpower limitation, and this would be the same problem the West would have in the same circumstance. What's causing Russia to bog down is cities like Chernov, Mariupol, Kharkov, obviously, Sumy, a little bit to this one. It's Mykolaiv? Sorry for the pronunciation. And Kiev. These 6 cities are what's causing the Russian offensive to grind to a halt. It seems that even though Ukraine has numerical superiority, their military forces are not adequate to actually fight open field battles. However, when you're talking about fighting in cities, especially when you're trying your best to not indiscriminately bomb and shell the city, which no matter how many civilian casualties are happening from shelling or bombing, it's clearly not indiscriminate. Russia has much larger capacity for artillery than they are clearly using. When you're talking about attacking a city with modern equipment, you can't use helicopters, Stinger missiles, or equivalent, like Igla-Ns, or other NATO missiles. The French Mistral, another example. These man-portable air defense weapons deny helicopters to fighting in cities, and they deny low-level bombing. It's too risky. The helicopter or bomber asset is worth too much money and too hard to replace considering how cheap the air defense is. So helicopters and low-level bombers are out. So you have high-level bombers, but then you have S-300s, and that makes it difficult to do high-altitude bombing. And additionally, high-altitude bombing is generally less accurate unless you're using laser-guided munitions or like GPS-guided munitions or other such weapons. Then you have armored vehicles, great for open country, but when you get into a city and every single building could have a javelin on the roof, you couldn't fire a javelin from a window, you'd kill yourself. But from the roof, you could fire a javelin, you could be in an alley, fire a javelin, fire an RPG. Again, not from inside a building unless you have a very wide open room because you kill yourself, but I guess you could lean out the window to shoot it. But anyways, that's neither here nor there. The anti-tank weapon could be from many directions, and you don't need very good anti-tank weapons to take out the rear or sides of a tank. And actually, javelin hits the top of the tank, typically. So that makes armored vehicles and tanks kind of a no-show against a well-equipped defenders. So then all you have left are infantry to clear buildings, and this is where your militia are actually not that bad. Because we're not talking about Spetsnaz clearing the city. Spetsnaz could probably burn through Ukrainian militiamen with minimal losses. We're not talking about that. We're talking about vanilla Russian infantry versus conscripts. These guys, the Russian infantry might have body armor, but they're not amazingly trained. They're not bad, but they're not. They're just normal. They're normal guys. They're the bread and butter. And in that circumstance, you don't need to be that good to fight to inflict casualties on someone. If you have 5 militia guys in a building and you break in the building with 10 guys, you could easily take 3 or 4 casualties to take out those 5 guys. And these militia guys, in my mind, in this example, have almost no training. These are the guys who've been given an AK and told to defend the country. Because you don't need to be very good at guns to dump a full auto burst into someone at 5 feet. Most of your bolts are going to miss, but you only need 1 or 2 to hit. Doesn't matter about the effectiveness. You're talking about just unloading lead on a known door or a known entry point that they're all coming through. It's very difficult. Now, there's all sorts of tactics for this, but there's also all sorts of room defense tactics. And then you start throwing in the Ukrainian military, Ukrainian special forces, even Ukrainian reservists, who have much more training than the militia guys, and then it gets even more difficult. And this would be true even if NATO was doing it. We also see this happening, or we also have seen this happen in Syria. Syria, the Assad/Russian forces did not really care to hold back on indiscriminate artillery or bombing, from what I can tell. And it still took years for cities like Damascus to be fully controlled by one faction. And that wasn't 2 nation states fighting. That was one nation state, in this case Syria, fighting rebels. Yes, the rebels had a high morale, very willingness to fight. They were supplied by U.S. and other forces, so they did have good equipment, or relatively speaking. But they lack the organizational and structural advantages that a state has in that situation. And this is where I think the crux of the matter of why I think people are getting the Russo-Ukraine war's conclusions wrong. We also got these wrong in Syria, and to a lesser extent even Iraq in 2003, though it wasn't quite as clear then because the Iraqis did not really have the foreign support, and the U.S. coalition brought way overwhelming firepower to deal with the Iraqis when they came to fighting in Baghdad and such like that. Whereas in Syria or in Ukraine, it's much more even fighting. It's not completely lopsided one faction or the other. The conclusion here, and what we should have already known, based on Syria, if we paid attention to it, based on Libya, if we paid attention to it, is urban warfare presently is an absolute bloodbath. The only viable solution seems to be siege. It's quite interesting. We have, in the 1700s, we still had forts. Forts were a valid part of military strategy. Coming in the 1800s with the advancement in artillery, forts were still valid, but were starting to become less and less useful. Up and until about World War I, when tanks are invented, artillery is so advanced, forts are basically not very useful. It's quite easy to go around them. You go to look at World War II, things like the Maginot Line, they worked properly, but the investment relative to the advantage does not seem to pay off. We've looped all the way back around now, it seems. Cities, not isolated forts in the countryside, cities are the new forts. And cities are extremely difficult to take unless you do not care about civilian casualties at all. And even if you don't care about civilian casualties, it's still extremely difficult and extremely expensive on men. You're going to lose a lot of men. Even the best soldiers in the world storming into a building that has enemy soldiers in it are going to take casualties. Your Spetsnaz are still going to take casualties attacking Ukrainian regulars in a building. Delta Force is still going to take casualties taking Russian forces in a building. Regular Russian infantry, Radier Motostrelki, they're still going to take casualties. It's long and bloody. And the conclusion I think people are drawing here is that Russia is inept. And they're not a serious threat. They're not a military power. They're a second-rate power who has a lot of nukes. That's not the right conclusion. Russia has faults in their military, yes. But newsflash, this war is going to give Putin and the Russian administration plenty of time to try out and figure out what those faults are. The West hasn't had this. Yes, the West has fought more wars than Russia / the USSR has. But think about it. What war has the West fought against an army that has been trained by the best men, the best Western special forces for 8 years, is equipped with the best weapons the West can have for the last 8 years? Well, the best anti-tank, anti-air weapons that the West can give them the last 8 years. The best body armor, the best, all this kind of stuff. The closest was Iraq in 1991 in the first Gulf War, but the big difference in Iraq 1 was the Iraqi military was first off completely incompetent, and second, and more importantly, they didn't have the best. Even if we hand-waved the Iraqi soldiers having far higher morale, much better officers, and more training, it still would have been a bloodbath because the basic thing, for example, Battle of 73 Easting, U.S. cavalry scouts, the 7 tanks and a battalion of them had longer range than any tank that Iraqis had. They were faster off-road than the tanks the Iraqis had. They had better command and control and target acquisition than the tanks the Iraqis had. It was always going to be a bloodbath because they could always kill them before they could get hit in return. And when they finally got within range to fight back, the Western tanks were superior. And the Iraqis didn't have modern ATGMs to try to fight the tanks. They didn't have attack helicopters to fight the tanks. They didn't have bombers. They didn't even have airplanes, really, at this point, to try to fight the tanks. All of these things are untrue in Ukraine. Ukraine still has all of those assets. They're not really using them. And unlike, and the most important one here is, unlike in 1991, we now have drones that can fly with anti-tank missiles. And it seems, based on the experience in Ukraine, that even though on paper they're easy to take out by air defense can't be everywhere. And drones are quite cheap for how much damage they can do. Even if you end up losing your drone, if you can pop 1 or 2 armored vehicles, that's not a bad trade. Because the important thing to keep in mind when you're talking about attacking, you kill the first couple tanks in a column on a road, you've stopped the whole column. Now, maybe you could go around them, maybe they have to move them off the road, doesn't matter. You've slowed the whole column down, you've bought yourself a lot of time, and you've not lost anybody. And that assumes that column had air defense relatively close to the front line. And even if they did have air defense, what if it doesn't have line of fire? Because there's buildings, or there's trees, or there's hills, or there's mountains blocking its line of sight. All is to say, I think we have to be very cautious in the West when we're looking at this war. I don't think we should write off the Russian military as inept. I don't think we should write off this war as strictly speaking, an embarrassment for Russia. There is some bad decisions they've made. I don't know why they're only going with 250,000 troops. I don't know why they haven't figured out, considering they sell their planes and their air defense missiles all over the place, why they haven't figured out why it's so hard to distinguish them, their own planes. There's all sorts of things that I don't know why they haven't fixed. That said, I do not think the West would be doing any better. If you did the exact same circumstances, and you don't give the West the ability to deploy 100% of their military forces, they can only deploy 250,000, I think they'd be equally bogged down. It's very hard to fight in cities, so you need to siege them, which takes a lot of men to have an actual blockade, which means the front lines are too thin to keep pushing. That's what this is boiled down to. I think when Mariupol is taken out, and when the Russians fully control Mariupol here, and they fully control Chernov, which who knows how long that's going to take, but once they do that, I think we're going to see another big push. I would imagine that their big push is going to be like this and like that to try to encircle the Ukrainian army over here. But for now, that's not happening. And it's really hard to tell when that could happen, because again, they have 6 major cities they're fighting in. It seems like they're pulling back from Mykolaiv down here. Again, I apologize for pronunciation, but that doesn't mean it's over. Doesn't mean Russia's, strictly speaking, incompetent. What we need to do, if we want to be smart here, is we have to look at this war. We have to assume Russia's not incompetent and they don't have any issues that Russia's doing are not intrinsically Russian issues. And we have to figure out and observe how modern war between two comparable powers works. This is the first example in living memory of two nations with similar military strength, though Russia having a larger military, but similar quality, going up against each other. Every other war has been less quality troops getting it destroyed by Western militaries, or equally guerrilla wars. This is neither. This is two comparable militaries fighting, and we have to take it as such. I fear we're going to draw the wrong conclusion. We're going to discount Russia, and then we're going to stumble ourselves into World War III like morons. Does that mean we don't do anything to Russia? No. It means you have to have a measured approach, and we have to treat the Russian military like it's an actual threat up until, on the field of battle, we find out, oh, the U.S. cavalry scouts can destroy an entire brigade of Russian tanks without any losses. Huh, who would have thought? That's kind of cool. We want that moment to be an accident. You don't want to plan for that moment, because if you plan for it and it doesn't work out, you just lost hundreds of men, dozens of vehicles, for nothing. And in modern war, it's very difficult to replace that kind of things. It's very expensive to replace those things. You do not want to take that mistake. This is not even to talk about how difficult it is to replace the highly trained troops the West has, who, in often cases, have years and years, if not decades, of active training, actual combat experience. Throwing that away because we undervalued the Russian military is silly. And I think we would also fall into the same problem. We have to try to figure out how urban warfare works by looking at this war before we get ourselves into a war. Now, that said, I hope you enjoyed the video. This is slightly different than I would normally do. If you like this kind of thing, let me know, and I might throw these in every now and then. I just couldn't resist talking about this because I've been seeing all sorts of things in the news. Even some of my friends that I play games with or interact in real life have been saying things like this, that Russia's military looks bad, or this is really embarrassing for Russia. And I don't entirely discontent that it's embarrassing for Russia, but I don't think we should assume the Russian military is bad. That all said, if you liked the video, please like, share, subscribe, comment all the things you would ever comment. Otherwise, I hope you have a great day, and this is not replacing this week's video on Sunday. This is just an additional video